All right. Well, thank you for taking some time out of a beautiful rain day to join us inside for food and some conversation around this book and the related work, Feed Us with Trees by Elspeth Hay, who is joining us here from Maine and Cape Cod. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm very excited. I found this book in my local library. Um, and they had it right on display, and I snatched it right up as soon as it came out. And I read it as quickly as I could, and I've been sharing it with folks since. And we've been trying to connect now for a few months.
Yeah.
So this was a great opportunity because you're speaking this evening in Shelburne, Vermont, at Shelburne Farms. I think you can still register that. The link was sent around too with the registration for this event. And then tomorrow at Middlebury College or alma
Yes.
mater.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay.
And those two events they're pretty similar.
pretty similar.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Great. And yeah, so super excited about the book and all of the knowledge that you're bringing together in the book. And Elspeth was kind enough to bring some apparently autographed copies, right? Is that what I saw?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
With us, or with her. And I see, I didn't recognize that award in my library copy. Is that something
It's
new?
new. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is the
The
Living Now Book Award. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So this is organized with support from Institute for Agroecology and Leadership for the Ecozoic. So thank you, all of you involved with those efforts. I'm going to open up with a few questions. I have many, and I'll try not to have too many, but then we're going to have it more of an open conversation, give people a chance in the room to enjoy the lunch, and then think about whatever questions you're cogitating over. But I think one thing, just maybe a little bit about how you came to write the book in the first place, like what motivated it, because you had a journalism background, not necessarily in agroecology.
Yeah, I had a little bit of both. In high school I went to a semester program at a place called Chewonki, the Maine Coast semester, and we worked on a farm there. I went to Middlebury, studied environmental studies, and ended up getting a job with our local NPR station on Cape Cod, reporting on food. So I was constantly asking people questions about food and coming at it with an environmental studies background, trying to understand why people were growing food the way they were and how that was impacting the landscape around them. And I think it's mostly like sort of hopeful local stories, but Cape Cod, for anyone who's been there, is basically just a sand dune. There's not a lot of space for agriculture. And where I live at the end of the Cape, about 70% of the land is protected as part of the Cape Cod National Seashore. So it's almost all forested. And I definitely had always seen that forested land as sort of an impediment to local agriculture because I grew up in Maine and then lived in Vermont, and there's so much sort of traditional farm field farming happening in both of those places. And that had always been my understanding of a food producing landscape. So about 6 years ago, I guess, I learned that we can eat acorns, and acorns were literally constantly raining down on my house. I'm surrounded by oak trees, and I was intrigued, and started doing some research on that. And it also, that sort of tied into this long-standing, I think, confusion I've had about, why do all these other species seem to have a habitat and a place in the living world around us, and we always seem to have to destroy those places to create what we needed. So this idea that maybe we could eat acorns and that could change our relationship to the places where we live was really exciting. And so that kind of started a tree nut rabbit hole that expanded from acorns into chestnuts, into hazelnuts and walnuts. And really, I'm still digging. So
Nice. And you bring a lot of different characters and people together in the book.
yes.
But just to stay with the nut trees for a minute as sort of the main agents, they're amazing. And wondered if you could give us a sense of how amazing they are, especially the nut trees we find around here.
Yeah, so are people here familiar with the idea of a keystone species? Guessing yes. Yeah, so right around when I learned that we can eat acorns, my mom got really interested in an entomologist named Doug Tallamy. People, okay. So he was doing all that research on oaks and caterpillars, and learning that oaks have this really outsized importance ecologically. So when you're looking at Lepidoptera, it's sort of this indicator for how many species of insects these trees support. And oaks are the top sort of life support genus in, I think, 84% of counties in North America where they occur. So just this huge outsized importance. If you look at some of the work that Tallamy's done, because he's studying these relationships between insects and plant species, and he found that there's sort of this list of the heavy lifters, which includes oaks, black cherry, also a lot of other nut trees, chestnuts, hazelnuts, beech, walnuts. There's a list of about 20 species. And oaks as a genus support, I think, 557 species of Lepidoptera caterpillars. And when you go down the list, there's sort of like three others that are even close to that, and then it immediately drops into the 100s. And those are the top 20. So some species support almost none, or maybe just one. And so when we're looking at the amount of life that a landscape can support and the amount of diversity, that is a huge indicator. And so I started learning about those two things at the same time. One, we can eat acorns, and two, wow, oaks, they've often been called the tree of life in past cultures. And I feel like we tend to often dismiss some of those phrases as like, oh, that's a cute old romantic phrase. But in the case of this tree, it's quite literal. Like, it is the top life supporting tree most of the places that it occurs. And so that made me start seeing this relationship between humans and these trees really differently. And we can talk a little bit more about the history of different cultures eating acorns, but it turns out that humans and oak trees have, and some of these other nut trees have, a really ancient relationship almost everywhere that we have occurred together. And that it's actually been our job in a lot of traditional cultures to take care of these trees and to help promote habitat and this life-giving habitat for other species, which for me was a complete turnaround on the ag stories that I learned as a kid, which was basically like, we kill everything to produce our food.
Yeah, and there was a book actually that was just spoken to, I can't remember the title right now, but it was released between Earth Day yesterday, Arbor Day today.
Oh, nice.
That also talks about the regeneration of Northeast forests, particularly in Vermont, that was down to like 20% of land cover.
Yeah,
now it's up to 80%. Not the same quality of composition, but it's shifted. But I wonder, like you talk about how important they are as keystone species in the cultural dimensions. How has that changed over time? Like, give us a sense of like the extent historically of oak and other nut trees.
Yeah, trying to think about what angle to go into that at.
Yeah.
I think that at least when I was sort of a kid and young adult, I always had this idea of kind of like these old growth, untouched, like the primeval forest as like a natural forest. And that's a pretty colonial idea, actually. If you look back through human history, in most places, forest wasn't kind of like this untouched place in most cultures. It was very interacted with landscape. And so when we're talking about, at least in the East, I'm most familiar with forest history around where I am on Cape Cod, but also sort of throughout New England and Eastern North America. The forest composition really changed pretty significantly as soon as European settlers started arriving, and clear cutting in a lot of instances, places for agriculture. Before that, for about 9,000 years, under indigenous management techniques, there was an oak hickory forest that stretched throughout most. Vermont is sort of at the northern, I was thinking today, I was like, oh, Vermont's, I don't know. I don't know quite as much about where Vermont lies on that line. Obviously, that line is kind of changing right now with climate change, but this oak hickory forest really stretched from like the southern states up into at least northern Massachusetts, kind of like right on that border with Vermont. And there were some pretty dramatic changes in climate throughout those 9,000 years. But because of indigenous burning, that oak hickory forest stayed pretty stable throughout a lot of regions. So then when you had European settlers come in and clear cut very extensively, and also there were a lot of changes also to the fire regime where now, we've kind of been in an era of fire suppression, but before that, there was this era where because of all the clearing and logging, there was actually an increase in fire where landscapes had lost a lot of their water resources, were really dry, there was a lot of wildfire. Um, and now we've seen this rebound in forest. So it's kind of like a more steady state, sort of mid-successional forest, followed by really early successional habitat with a lot of clearing. And now we're moving sort of past that middle state in a lot of areas. I've talked with foresters up and down, eastern seaboard, and like I talked with someone in Pennsylvania, and their job was to encourage oak regeneration and also suppress fire. And those two jobs are kind of at odds with each other because in a lot of cases, fire is what oaks need. They need you to kind of check the successional state from continuing into those more shade tolerant species. So now we're going toward more of this later successional maple, birch, hemlock type forest in a lot of areas. So it's a pretty big shift. And we also lost the American chestnut. So the blight, does anyone not know about the chestnut blight? Um, that okay, so a fungal blight came in the early 1900s, and in the first few decades between about 1900 and the 1940s, basically rendered the American chestnut functionally extinct. And so that created this huge gap in
because of how extensive the habitat of chestnut.
It was very extensive, like up and down, especially in the mountains, in the Appalachian Mountains, hugely extensive. I think they estimate there are about 4 billion trees that died. And a lot were logged, a lot were cut because they were trying to check the spread. And unfortunately, in cutting all of those, if any of them did have genetic resistance or diversity, that was lost. So there have been some pretty significant changes in what we see when we go outside into the woods now. We've lost a lot of diversity because after that clear cutting, what came back wasn't necessarily as diverse as what was there before. Was a long answer.
No, that was great. And you mentioned fire in there too. Today, statewide, there's a fire risk.
Yeah.
Just under current conditions, and this is spring. So that's a reality going forward. And I know you've been doing a lot of your own work to learn fire, and a lot of that learning is based in indigenous knowledge. So not only have we lost trees, we've lost a lot of the knowledge as to how to relate to the trees. So I wonder if you wanted to say a little bit more about what you've learned, especially with regards to fire.
Yeah. So when I first got interested in eating acorns and acorns as a human food source, it turns out when you get into acorns, it's a really small acorn world, and you start meeting acorn friends all over the place. So an acorn friend introduced me to a man named Ron Reed, who is part of the Karuk tribe in present-day Northern California in the Klamath River region. And he and I started talking about acorns sort of during the early COVID-19 pandemic. And I ended up going out there to visit him. But every time we talked in the beginning, he kept talking about fire and oaks. And I did not know what he was talking about. I had not really much of a concept of fire as part of oak forests where I had grown up and where I was living on the Cape. And he, through our conversations, really opened my eyes to this relationship between oaks and fire. So a lot of oak species, not all, but many, are what's called fire adapted. So they share this suite of traits with thick bark, seeds that sprout readily in a fire burned landscape, ability to sprout back really quickly after a fire, so to outcompete other species. And if you start looking at oak health and oak regeneration in different woodlands all over the Northern Hemisphere, there has been a lack of oak regeneration over the past 100 years in a huge variety of different places in Asia, in Europe, in North America. And in the 1980s, researchers sort of started trying to understand why. And a lot of tribal communities at the same time were saying, hey, we need to be burning, and we're not burning. And that's having this really devastating effect on the oak trees. And especially in places where people have relied on that as a food source for a long time, saying, hey, we're losing access to these traditional foods because we can't burn due to fire suppression. And that's what's necessary for oak regeneration and to keep these trees really productive and healthy. So I ended up learning after getting to know Ron. I learned that there was actually one of the oldest prescribed fire studies in the Northeast was less than a mile from my house. Turns out they had been burning for the last 35 years. And Cape Cod, because it's so sandy and water doesn't stay in the soil, it just drains through really quickly, is actually a super fire-prone place. And I had not known that. So I started going on some prescribed fires on the Cape and learning a little bit more about that history. And as I did, I really started to understand that not only have humans and these nut trees been in relationship for thousands of years, but that in many places, fire has been a really key part of that relationship, and that we fall into this. We hear a lot about keystone species, right? Like oaks are a keystone species. They're so important. If you take them out, this whole ecosystem falls apart. And actually, in a lot of ecosystems, humans play that same role with fire. So we fall into that category of keystone species the same as beavers, right? So beavers are ecosystem engineers. They create dams, that creates wetlands. They're incredibly important to this habitat creation and maintenance. And historically, all over the world, in a huge variety of different habitats and cultures, our role has been to do that with fire. It's not our only way of creating habitat. We also have a lot of other techniques like rotational grazing or coppice or pollard or some of these other woodland techniques, but fire is probably our oldest tool and one of our most important. And so when we have tried, even with fire suppression, we are actually the leading cause of fire almost all over the world. So it's not really working what we're trying to do, but when we've taken out fire intentionally, those ecosystems have started to fall apart because we're taking ourselves out as a keystone species. And for me, that's a really big mindset shift coming from this background of Western science of always seeing ourselves as bad. And, maybe the best thing we can do for the land is just kind of like shrink or do less and be less. But actually, in a lot of cases, that active relationship with fire is really needed. Which is exciting, and also it's really fun to light things on fire. So.
And there's so much
in a
to it.
careful way.
I haven't looked at it, only scratching the surface, but as you describe it here, I mean, there's so much to learn, like how you use fire and what time of year and what ways.
So
It's
much
so
to learn.
Complex.
Yeah.
So basic.
Yeah, well, it's kind of fire is really interesting because when you look at sort of the list of jobs that are involved in what we think of as food production, right? We want to control water on the land, we want to control weeds on the land, pests and pathogens, we want to fertilize. And that's sort of this long list of jobs. And in traditional sort of Western New England type farming, we do that with a lot of different tools, right? Like we're preparing the land for the crop with a plow, maybe, weeding, using irrigation. And when I went out to spend some time with Ron Reed on the Klamath River, he and other fire practitioners there were doing all those same jobs, but fire was the main tool they were using. So with a carefully timed fire, they were able to sort of suppress this pest called the acorn weevil, which lays a little maggot-like worm in the acorns, if anyone's ever seen one. It's not really what you want to find in your dinner, although you can eat them and they won't hurt you. So they were timing the smoke from the fires to kill the weevils. And burning was helping to control the amount of trees on the landscape so that instead of getting too many trees, more than the water cycle of that landscape could support, and then kind of alternating between wildfire and going back to the beginning of succession, they were sort of controlling it with regular prescribed fires. But the seasonal timing of that and how often, like, are you burning every spring and every fall? Are you burning once every 10 years? What frequency the land needs is totally place by place. So it's not just like, okay, we're going to go out and start burning, and then there's going to be an oak forest. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of nuance to get to know when fire might be an appropriate tool and when it's time to sort of step back. And I think out west, where that history of sort of indigenous cultures and colonial expansion, that tension point, and when those cultures are meeting, is so much more recent. You can still read a lot of that fire history on the land. A lot of trees are still alive with fire scars from traditional indigenous management. Whereas in the East, a lot of those trees are dead. It's not as easy to read the landscape to figure out some of that history.
So, a good book can change the way one sees the world. So thank you for that. And for me, one of the ways is as you're walking through the woods or a field, even you understand that what we're seeing now is not necessarily what that land wants to be, or what it could be, or certainly not what it's been. I'm interested to one of the themes that you talk a lot about is this our ideas around food and where food comes from, and or even what if agriculture and a farm look like. Just in your writing of the book, how has writing it changed the way you think about farming and where food comes from?
I think that I was really taught to see a food producing landscape as a field of row crops. And that is such a narrow view of what a food producing landscape can be. That is one way to produce food. And I think it's an important part of the way that we produce food. But if you look at the food species and the food landscapes that a lot of our farms in North America are focused on, it's first of all, a lot of species that are native to Europe. I definitely found when I was researching the book, like realizing that a lot of these farms that we're creating, there's almost like this attempt to recreate a European landscape in almost like without acknowledging sort of, okay, you're in a different place now, and there's other species, without an attempt to kind of get to know some of the species of this place that so many of those farmers have come from. But there's also, if you look back through traditional farming techniques from all over the Northern Hemisphere, from such a variety of cultures, almost every culture had some foods that were produced in sort of a field or that early successional type landscape. Some foods that were taken from forested landscapes and produced through forest tending, some foods that came from wetlands and water landscapes. And it's like we have just dialed in on the most narrow definition of what food production can be, and we're ignoring all of these other landscapes. And we don't even necessarily always do it on our plates, right? Like people eat fish, people are eating from these other landscapes. But when we talk about food production and we talk about how we're going to feed the world and the farms that we need to feed the world, that conversation is almost always centered around these huge monoculture row crops. And we actually don't even eat most of that food that we produce that way. Like with corn in this country, we eat 1% of the corn that we produce that way. But there's still this really strong food mythology where, like, that's how we're going to feed everyone. But that doesn't even have that much to do with food right now. So I think I really found when I was researching the book how powerful some of our stories are and how disconnected they are from the reality of food production. Even if we change nothing, like those stories already really don't reflect how we're actually producing food.
Yeah, it's great, Elspeth. And I really appreciate your focus on the yield question
Yeah,
too.
I'm
Because
kind of
that's often,
obsessed with that.
yeah, I mean, it's great. And you really break it down in such an interesting way of asking, I think for like a group of a research community thinking about, well, what if we put much more intention and research into generating a yield, not necessarily in the same types of economic system, but if we generated some sort of a yield for actually meeting our needs for nutrition through this type of approach, as we have done through these more conventional modes, I think that's a fantastic question.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of really interesting further research that could be done there. So when I was sort of getting interested in acorns and some of these other tree nuts as a food source, I kept bumping into that question of like, well, but they probably don't produce enough, right? Because they can't feed the world. When you I know, I took a lot of environmental studies college courses, and you're looking at sort of those graphs of world population and world grain production, and they're always shown side by side. And the implication is the population can only be this size if we're also doing this kind of grain production. Um, and so I started to question this idea, like, could we really eat from these trees? Or is this just sort of this romantic historic thing that lots of people used to do, but it's not really practical anymore because there's so many more people on Earth? Uh, and when I started to break it down, it falls apart from so many different angles so quickly. The first angle, which we just talked about, is like, we are not eating 99% of the food that we are producing that way, at least in cornfields. So this idea that like we have to farm this way to feed people falls apart very quickly from that standpoint, because 99% of that land could be doing something else. Even if we still need 1% of that land to grow corn that way, that is not very much land. And then if you look at it from a caloric standpoint, we often talk about yield in pounds, right? But a pound of corn and a pound of nuts have really different nutritional value. Corn has about, I think, 1/6 of the calories and nutrient density of something like an acorn or a walnut or a hazelnut. So pound for pound isn't really a great comparison either, right? And even if you just want to look at how much land would it take to produce the same amount of food, what we often don't factor in. So there's a really amazing agronomist named Ricardo Salvador, who I spoke with when I was researching the book. And he reminded me that yield is a ratio. So when we're talking about how much land it takes to produce food, when we're talking about, say, again, corn production, and now there's a man in Maryland, I'm forgetting his name. He has produced, I think, 37,000 pounds of tons. I actually can't remember. Some ridiculous amount of corn per acre. If you're looking at historic yields, they're like 2,000 and he's at 37,000 pounds. So just this huge increase. But it's an artificial number because we're not counting all the land we're counting the land that's actually yielding that, but you're not counting the land that it took to get the water to create that. You're not counting the land that it took to create the fertilizer. You're not counting the land that it took to use, whatever oil and gas inputs. And when you actually are using accurate denominators and nominators, accurate yield measurements, because when we're talking about feeding the world, land is the limiting factor, right? You have to count all of the land that you're using, not just this little artificial production island. Those high yields go away immediately, and they're actually reversed. So a fully functioning ecosystem where maybe you have a diverse polyculture of crops, and some are tree crops and some are field crops, and maybe you have a wetland or whatever producing fish, that is actually per acre a much more productive way to feed people, and you can produce more food with less land. So I think that right now we really have the conversation a little bit backwards. We're trying to intensify food production onto smaller and smaller pieces of land, but meanwhile the externalities of that just get bigger and bigger and are affecting more and more land. And so instead of trying to produce food on as little land as possible. I feel like shifting the conversation toward how could we produce food differently so that land that's producing food isn't a wasteland, isn't, somewhere that we're hurting, but instead land that we're having a really healthy relationship with.
Culture.
Yeah.
That's great. I'll ask one more question and we'll turn it to all of you and online, and feel free online to type a question, and Reed, you can take those. Yeah. Okay. So type a question into the chat. Just getting back to the plates, what's your favorite way to consume tree nuts? By the way, we tried to get them on the pizza, but they didn't have them quite.
They didn't have them. That's okay. I would say that
Yeah.
chestnuts and well, a few. So chestnuts make a really great flour. I got to spend some time in Switzerland with a friend who lives in Val Bregaglia, which is on the border of Switzerland and Italy. It has a really ancient chestnut producing culture that I think we could learn a lot from. And we said before that the American chestnut died out because of blight. There are a lot of hybrid blight resistant chestnuts that people are experimenting with in the Midwest as farm crops. So you can grow chestnuts in North America today, just not the exact same ones that we had before. But they have this really amazing food culture where, they're making gnocchi out of chestnut flour, pasta noodles, they're making desserts out of chestnut flour. And there's also a really strong tradition of eating the game animals that feed on chestnuts in that mountainous area. So I was there in the fall, and you go to a restaurant and everything kind of involves chestnuts in some way. There's a chestnut ravioli with pheasant that was eating chestnut in the forest. Really just amazing, amazing things. So with chestnuts, I think chestnuts are often called the bread tree because they are, compared to some other nuts like walnuts or hazelnuts, they're much more starchy. So it's a great nut to make flour out of. Acorns, it depends on the species of oak. So there's, I think, more than 600 species of oak worldwide. And I learned pretty quickly that when I was talking about an acorn and someone in Greece was talking about an acorn, someone in California, like, we're not talking about the same thing. They all do different things, and acorns have tannins. So has anyone ever tried to eat an olive straight off the tree? No, they're disgusting. So if you try to eat an olive, it also has tannins. They're really bitter. You'll spit it out. I made that mistake once. And they have to be leached out with water. So different species of oak have different levels of tannins, and it can be easier or harder to leach those tannins out. So in some places, acorns might be best suited for fattening pigs and eating the pig. In other places, acorns are really well suited for flour, because the tannins are really easy to leach out. They come right out, especially in the Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of cultures there that have made basically almost like a polenta or cream of wheat type hot cereal, for lack of a better word, with acorns. That's really good. And you can make it savory, you can make it sweet. And then there are also some areas where you can make acorn oil, and it's, from its chemical composition, really similar to olive oil in terms of what you can do with it. It's an amazing sunset orange color, so beautiful, and has a really nice neutral flavor. So acorns, I like to make crackers using the flour and like almost like a seed nut cracker. I think that's really good, using what we have in the Northeast, which is white oak and red oak. Those are sort of the two most dominant species. And then with hazelnuts and hickories, bitternut hickories, you can make a really amazing cooking oil, again, similar to olive oil. And hazelnuts, you can make both flour and oil. It has a strong flavor, so I feel like it's not as neutral as an acorn or a chestnut. You can definitely always taste that, like, you get hazelnut coffee or whatever, and it has that very specific flavor. And sometimes it's really nice, and sometimes you would be like, this is not the right thing at all for what I'm making. I hope that answered that.
Yeah.
And I think that might be next. Yeah.
It's the culture of agroforestry.
Yeah.
So questions, either online or in the room? Thanks, Elspeth.
Yeah, thank you. This is not about nut trees, but
That's
your
okay.
description of the chestnut blight made me think a little bit about how we are currently managing ash trees.
So similar.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, or if that came up at all in your research.
It didn't come up in my research for the book, but my family actually owns some land in Western Maine, and the ash tree situation has recently gotten really bad there. They all just started dying. And it's been interesting talking to local foresters and hearing their recommendations. I think similar to the past, some people are of the mind that you should just cut them all down. But I have been encouraged to hear some foresters saying, wait until you're sure they're dead and then cut them down. I do think that the forestry community definitely learned something from the chestnut blight and from the way that they were attempting to control the spread with just clear cutting the species, because we have so little genetic diversity left. And I do think that there is an active effort to wait, see if there's some pockets of resistance. But it's also, it can become kind of a hard choice from a landowner perspective. And we experienced that firsthand. So the land that we own is in the center of a town. Tons of people are walking on it, and several of the trees just started falling. You know, these huge, very old trees, and we started to get really nervous that someone was going to get killed. And so I think it can also be really place specific. And one thing that is definitely a little scary is how many different tree species we're seeing dealing with different issues. You know, we've got beech bark disease, beech leaf disease, we've got the hemlock woolly, I'm not gonna, yeah, so there are a lot of trees having a hard time. And I think, you know, we all know there's multiple different reasons for that, but I think that for me, figuring out how we can be an active participant in our forests and not taking just a complete hands-off approach, you know, not going in and saying, okay, we're gonna cut it all because it's not doing well, but also not saying like, well, we're just gonna watch because there's nothing good we can do. I think somewhere in between that, there is a sweet spot of management. You know, I know like my parents bought land in Maine in the 70s and they've never done anything in their woods because they sort of came up in that generation of like the best thing you can do is just leave it alone. And I think that we're really learning that that's not always true, that there are places and times where we can be really helpful. And so I don't know. Ash trees are, it's a hard one right now, but important, really important. Yeah.
Okay. I sort of following up on that same thing. I was curious hearing about the blight on the chestnut trees and then also all these other diseases that you're talking about. Is this a story of like Western civilization or Europeans came in and did something to the environment such that all these blights came through, such that they were way worse than they would have been otherwise? Or is it like if you have a diverse forest, then you could lose all the chestnuts and like it'd be okay because you have all these other trees? Like, yeah.
I think it's a story about sort of pace of change and the forest's ability to keep up. So since the 1500s, like the rate of just global mixing of species has been so widespread and so rapid that, you know, a pest or pathogen is coming from another continent and it's encountering species that have never seen this before and have no resistance to it. And at the same time, we're accelerating climate change. And so that combined rate of change is very stressful. I do think, so there's some with the American chestnut, just to give an example. I talked to so many people about chestnut restoration, and every single person I talked to had a completely different view on how we should be doing it and the right way and the wrong way and really strong views. And so some people believe we need to use genetic modification to create sort of a pure American chestnut, whatever that means, because you're also genetically modifying it. So I'm not totally convinced on that language, but this idea that they want to create, you know, as close to a genetically pure American chestnut as possible, and then reintroduce that to the forest. Some people are very into that. There's been work happening with that at SUNY. Other people are trying to do this back cross breeding where they're basically breeding generation by generation American chestnut, because there are still some American chestnuts in the woods. They're considered what's called functionally extinct, but the disease kills it back to the roots, but it doesn't kill it underground. So they'll keep resprouting. So we do still have some of that genetic diversity to work with. But they think we should carefully back cross. This has been going on since the 1980s, called the Burnham method. And we're gonna just find like sort of that 1 or 2 perfect trees, and then we're gonna clone those like a cultivar, like an apple cultivar, for instance. So that's another camp of thinking. There's many sort of variations on that, but I think that the most interesting approach that I heard about while I was researching the book, and I think it sort of applies to your question more broadly, was this man, Philip Rudder, who's been doing what he calls swarm breeding, which is basically the same method that indigenous people in the Americas use to create corn from teosinte. So it's almost creating a new species. So his premise is the world has gotten all mixed up, right? Every species from different continents we've got fungal blight from Asia. We can't go backwards. We're not going to unmix that. And so the original American chestnut is not adapted to the conditions of the present. Like bringing that back is not a solution to this problem of, okay, we want chestnuts. So what he's doing is he's breeding Japanese, Chinese, American, European. He's basically taken every chestnut species he can find, and he's done the math to figure out if you do X number of crosses, you're likely to get, first he breeds for 2 traits at a time. And once he gets those 2 traits just at large in the population, not on one tree, because that's always risky, right? When you just have a 1 tree cultivar, any disease comes in and that 1 tree has no resistance. Anytime we have more diversity, like it's a stronger population group. So he'll breed for cold hardiness, and then he'll breed for, nut size. And he's doing this at the population level, basically trying to create a new species that is adapted to the temperatures where he is, the diseases that are there, and for productivity. And to me, that approach makes sense to me. Like, we're not unmixing, we're not going backwards, I don't know, the purity mindset can get really murky really fast. And he's just like, we got to move into the future and we got to move there as fast as possible. We need to adapt to the current conditions. And I think there's a lot to be said for that as an approach.
Thanks for the question. So we have Tom.
I have a comment.
Then let's go online. Let's do online first, then we'll come back in here. Is that okay?
Lily has a question. First, Lily says, "This talk is so interesting. Thank you for sharing." And it's a question about water use. I was wondering how water use weighs into the longevity or sustainability of growing tree nuts as a larger food source. Maybe almonds are an outlier, but I've heard they require a lot of water.
Yeah, so growing a tree species in a place that is not very well adapted to requires a lot of water, which is what we are doing in California with almonds. Working with native tree species or cultivars that are kind of hybrids, but that generally do well in that sort of climatic zone, should not require any water beyond sort of those first 2 years of establishment. Just like with any, you're planting a seedling, it's going to need a little attention in the beginning. There's a really cool organization that if people are interested called the Savannah Institute in the Midwest that is super focused on, a lot of the Midwest used to be covered in oak savanna, which is a native habitat type. It's basically sort of big overstory oaks, and then these more open prairie savanna-like understories. And the Savannah Institute's mission is to get Midwest farmers on board with, moving away from corn and soy and toward this more imitation of a savanna type ecosystem with all the perennial species, including these nut trees that would be there. And that should require less water than our traditional row crop agriculture, because once those trees get established, in many cases, they're living for hundreds of years in a habitat that they're very well adapted to. And there is some work to do sort of assisted migration, because also climate is changing the equation as climate change accelerates. So sort of pushing trees toward their northernmost part of their range or out of what would be considered traditionally the northernmost part of their range. Which I think is actually really interesting in Vermont, because traditionally Vermont has kind of been at that northern edge of this oak hickory mix, and potentially it's going to be kind of smack dab in the center of that range as time moves on.
The maples are big thing.
Yeah, a lot of lobsters, cod. We're saying goodbye to some friends.
We'll go in the room, maybe we'll jump back and forth if there are more online.
I'm all right.
Okay, go ahead, Tom.
You refer to a couple examples, but I'm curious how animals fit into this, whether that's like wild game or livestock or animal husbandry. Kind of the forested food and tree systems interact. And
There's a lot of the people who are sort of introducing this system in the Midwest have involved animals. And I think that animals can be a really important part. If you're starting from sort of a bare farm field and you're actually intentionally planting an ecosystem that's using these nut trees and is sort of an imitation of a former natural habitat, then obviously during the initial establishment phase, you would either need to protect those trees because they're really tasty. But it's interesting seeing different examples of how people are going about it. So some people that I visited with in the Midwest and went to farms, they're planting, like I'm talking about, and they've got pigs and chickens and sort of some of those more traditional farm animal species that we're talking about. And then other places that I've visited, there's this goal of restoring wildlife habitat, and with that comes improved hunting and improved habitat for game species like deer or turkeys or quail. But in both of those examples, animals are very much a part of the system. So I think there's a lot of room for that. And, when I visited Switzerland, like animals were as much a key staple food that came out of the chestnut system as the nuts themselves. And I think, if you look at what we're doing with corn and soy, just to go back to that, a lot of that 99% that we're not eating is being fed to animals that would do a lot better in a more native oak savanna habitat. So we're doing all this work to plant this crop that's actually not even the best food for those animals. So I think that even if we decided like we just love corn tortillas and wheat bread and we don't want to change anything about the way that we eat, even if we just change what animals are eating to sort of these nut savannas, that would be a massive improvement in habitat in the US, and it would be a massive improvement in animal health without even changing anything that we are consuming. So I think it's a huge opportunity.
You kind of touched on it already, but I was gonna ask about your thoughts for assisted migration and how that plays into which you started. So
I think assisted migration is like so cool. I have a friend in Pennsylvania who's been doing a lot with trees that, like I said, he's just pushing them maybe 50 miles, 100 miles past what was considered the northern edge of their range. I have a mulberry in my yard that I, without realizing, planted about 15 years ago. And when I started looking at the maps, I realized like, oh, it's way outside of what would have been considered its northernmost range. And I think that, there's obviously questions of scale. If you're planting one tree in your yard, like how much is that helping migration? Well, it's a little, but when we're talking about some of the work like what you're doing, like ecosystem restoration, that word is so loaded, right? Like, what are we restoring it to? Where is it going? Are we trying to pick some arbitrary point from 500 years ago and we're restoring it to that? Or are we restoring health with an eye toward how the climate and the landscape and our own needs and, all these different factors are changing? And I think that assisted migration is a really important part of that equation.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, as we sort of like look forward towards some of these transitions, like how you see both like what farmers need to transition to some of these new systems, and also like what consumers need maybe to start being introduced to some of these foods or making them like accessible to people?
Yeah. So I think there's sort of like a macro level answer to that question and then more of a practical detail level. But when I started researching the history of these tree crops and looking at how widespread they were and now how few of us are eating them, our loss of relationship almost everywhere you look was tied to the development of our modern economic system. And this idea, there was a story that was actively promoted at the same time as colonial expansion of this economic system. And that is this idea that the world out there is scarce. And so it doesn't have what you need. And the way to be okay and to feed yourself is to be part of this economy and this system. And that's the only way that you're going to have enough. And so this idea, I call it like the no farms, no food story in the book. This idea has gone hand in hand with our current global economy every step of the way. And it's been necessary to convince people that that is true in order to bring them into this system. And when that started, when that story first started, it was very explicit. Like no one was trying to hide it. It's a really fascinating history because everybody knew that wasn't true. People had been in relationship with these different landscapes for thousands of years. They knew there was food out there. They knew that that was not true. But over the centuries, depending where you're looking, there's different timelines. I think that a lot of us have really come to just internalize and accept that story. So we need a new economic system, which is just, a little easy thing that we're going to figure out tomorrow. But on the sort of, well, what can we do right now without having a new economic system level? A lot of farmers need financial help and different types of financing to switch from an annual row crop model to a more perennial crop model because you don't get a yield for the first 5 to 10 years. And so you can't just put the crop in the ground and then you're going to get some money. So there's been a lot of efforts, especially through the Savannah Institute and those groups in the Midwest, because this movement really is, I feel like, growing out in many ways from farmers in the Midwest who are so fed up and desperate and working inside such a broken system that they're like, we'll try anything. Like, this is not working. And so there's been a lot of efforts there to come up with creative financing partnerships. And I think from the sort of consumer side, when you look at the statistics, there are no statistics on how many acorns we eat a year because we don't even talk about that. Chestnuts, I think it's like 0.2 pounds per year, which is maybe like 1 nut per person in the US. Hazelnuts is a little higher, but we don't have a lot of a cultural connection in the US to some of these foods. And so I think I've been feeling hopeful about it recently because where I live on the Cape, there's been a real shift in the fish types that fishermen are catching. And when I moved there 20 years ago, there were all these sort of events and talks and tasting things like try hake, try monkfish, and nobody had ever heard of or eaten those fish. And it has taken about 20 years, but now they're like, it's on the menu. It's in the fish market. Like that educational campaign and that kind of cultural shift has really worked pretty effectively. And so I think that that's also a really important component, is just introducing these foods to people who have never tried them or heard of them.
Online question too.
We'll go online and then come back in the room. Yes, go ahead.
Sophie says, hi Elspeth, thanks for the talk. And this is a question about processing. I was curious to know about processing of tree nuts for flour or oil. Do we need specialized flour mills or processing facilities? I'm also curious if you have any ideas about developing global markets for tree nut products.
Yeah. There is some interesting work happening in Western Mass with development of some tree nut product networks. I would definitely recommend checking out Big River chestnuts. They're sort of a leader in the tree nut world in New England. Also, Buzz Ferver in Vermont. I don't know him as well, just because he's a little further out of my geographic area, but he's also doing some really cool stuff. In terms of processing, it depends on the nut. You don't necessarily need a specialized mill, but the basic process, I just actually did an interview with a chestnut cooperative in Ohio, where they are now using their chestnut processing equipment where they're drying the chestnuts, they're shelling the chestnuts, inspecting for quality, and then grinding them into flour. And they have found that that same equipment line works really well for acorns. They just started experimenting. But acorns have that additional step of you have to leach out the tannins. So they're just kind of figuring that aspect out. You can do it at home. I have found chestnuts almost impossible to process at home because when you dry a chestnut, you have created a rock. And it is a much bigger rock than an acorn rock and just much harder to break down. But where I was in Switzerland, the same mill that was processing wheat flour was also processing chestnut flour. So it's not a different milling process. Acorns, depending which species you're working with, and hazelnuts, they're a little more oily than a chestnut. So you don't want peanut butter type consistency, right? So that can be a little different, but if they're really well dried and they're a starchier version, again, that same milling equipment can work pretty well. And with the oil, an expeller presser, similar to what you'd use to make some sunflower oil or some of these seed nut oils, can be used with some of these nuts. And I think the most promising oil in our region in New England is bitternut hickories. So bitternut hickories, the name, as a name kind of suggests, similar to acorns, they have a lot of tannins, but tannins are water soluble. So that bitterness does not come out in the fat. So just same with olive oil. When you make table olives, you have to leach them. You have to soak them in water to get those tannins out to make them palatable. But when you make olive oil, instead of just table olives, you can just press the oil and the tannins are not getting into the oil. So bitternut hickory is kind of having a moment as a little cottage industry in the Northeast. And if Sophie wants contacts, I can put her in touch with some of the people involved with that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Elspeth, for that. My name is Lisa, and I'm a postdoc at the Institute of Agroecology. Yeah, I was kind of thinking along sort of similar lines, and I'm working on a project right now about regional food governance in New England. And when we're talking about shifting markets, right, away from the monocultures and the commodity production, do you think that tree foods and perennials are kind of inherently more oriented to regional food systems and could, kind of lend themselves to a different way of thinking about markets, like less able to be appropriated for, say, large export crops or something like that. And if so, how do you think that? Like, for example, doing the vegan movement is trying to regionalize the food system. I don't know how much tree nuts are part of that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how much they're part of that conversation yet, but I think that they should be a really important part. I don't think that they have, besides oaks have a little bit of one inherent quality that makes them hard to sort of fit into the mainstream commodity crop program, which is that they do something called masting. So oaks will produce a huge crop one year and then a much smaller crop in some other years, which makes them very hard to standardize. Chestnuts, it's sort of the same every year. Hazelnuts, very similar every year. And one guy that I talked to at a place in Asheville, North Carolina called the Nuttery, where they're doing some really cool cooperative processing, buying from wild pickers and farmers and then producing oils and flours. He was basically like, and that's what I like about oaks, because like they can't fit it into the system. So the system has to break and it's gonna reconfigure. But then I've heard other people who are like, we'll just breed an oak that produces the same, we'll figure that out through breeding. And from a shelf stability standpoint, like there's really no reason that they couldn't be fed into the same commodity crop type system that we have today. And so I think that is something to pay attention to. Like the last thing that I'm interested in is creating a new monoculture of oak trees. Like, would it be slightly better than a monoculture of corn? Maybe, but that's not what I find so interesting about these trees, because they're supporting lots of life. And so including that life in the food production system is a little more exciting and interesting. But I think that, you know, they have the qualities of any staple food, which is like you sort of need a staple starch and you need a staple fat. And acorns, because of their tannins, they can store for decades. Tannins are an amazing preservative, which is like the bad part is they're bitter. The good part is that food's not going to rot. Chestnuts, once you dry them, they're shelf stable for a really long time, but that's also a really important component of a staple food. I do think that from the market side, developing sort of regional processing centers and regional hubs is key, because without that, it's really hard to make it a real staple food. There's a group, I'm just thinking about your work, the Appalachian Staple Foods Collaborative. They're working with beans, nuts, seeds, grains, forgetting the big one. But they're doing a lot of cool work around trying to figure out how those types of regional processing hubs could work. Appalachian Staple Foods Collaborative.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. Questions?
This, I'm assuming, is in the book somewhere that I'm excited to read. But I was like realizing that in talking about trees feeding us, you focus a lot on tree nuts, and like what I would have said in second grade is like, oh yeah, like oranges and like apples. And I'm curious, is like, are you focusing on tree nuts because that's what's understudied, or because like there's more potential for it to be a staple food, or for it to be more, calories per acre or something?
I think I focus on it partly because I feel like so few of us are talking about it. But also partly because, yeah, when I think about what could really feed you long term, and it's like, I don't know if anyone, you guys have shad bush here, right? Service berries. Has anyone ever eaten those? Like eating a lot of berries versus eating a lot of nuts, like you're just gonna be fuller longer, and it's more of a staple crop with these nuts. And also they're so important for biodiversity, but there are also, I can send out Doug Ptolemy's sort of list of those top 20 woody plant species. There's lots of fruits on there too. And I think those are also an important component of any food system. Obviously, oranges are probably not going to work great for us up here, but blueberries, cranberries, grapes, we have a lot of native fruits that do really well in our ecosystems, and are perennial, and are also an important part of any food system.
Lucio, and then we'll come back. Go ahead.
You mentioned that you don't want to see like cultures of oats, but can you expand more on what's your vision of more tree nuts and what are they replacing?
Yeah, I think if we could only do one thing, like I said before, just replacing the corn and soy land that we currently have for animal food production with an oat savanna ecosystem. I mean, that's like 50% of that corn land right there, just converted to a really healthy, productive ecosystem that's good for the animals, good for the land. But when we're talking about New England and sort of like what can we do in our local landscapes, a lot of our forests, and again, Vermont is right on that line, so I don't want to say necessarily this is true of all of Vermont, but at least in Massachusetts, where I am, a lot of our oak forests are degraded in terms of not having as much biodiversity as they once did. So like Cape Cod was completely clear cut. Bringing back in some of those other species like hickories and hazelnuts would be really beneficial from a food production standpoint, and also beneficial from an ecosystem health standpoint. So taking forest land that we're already managing and thinking about them as food producing landscapes, even if that's not necessarily commercial, just like you can go pick up food there, I think would be kind of a critical first step. And then for a model for what that kind of market could look like, in the town where I live, Wellfleet, we're, out on the Cape surrounded by water. There is a really old and productive aquaculture tradition. So we have a lot of people in town. I think maybe 30% of people who live, I don't quote me on that statistic, could be wildly wrong, but a lot of people in town are aquaculture farmers. So they're growing shellfish, which are helping to co-create this healthy watershed and also producing human food. And some people go out as wild pickers, right? They don't have a shellfish farm, they don't own land, but there's commons areas where you can go and you just get a license and you can pick up shellfish and you can sell it to a wholesale dealer. And other people are farmers and they have a specific plot called a grant where they're growing shellfish and they can also sell to that same wholesale facility. And I think my husband is in that world. So I've seen that model. I've seen how well that works. And the closest thing that I've seen in the nut industry is this company called Hammond's, which has been a black walnut company in sort of the Appalachia and the East since the early 1900s. And they have a very similar model where they buy from farmers, they buy from people just going out into the woods and wild picking up from common places. And then they have a central processing facility and they're processing those nuts for market. So I think whether it's planting more farms or just improving the food production and health of our common spaces, both of those are avenues toward creating something more like that, where it's a regional food product.
Your chapter on the commons is especially interesting.
I know we didn't really get into that, but there's
But
a lot to talk about there too.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I have a weird question about tannins.
No weird questions.
So I studied plant and insect interactions, and so whenever I hear tannins, I'm like, okay, this is one of the ways that any plant like exercises agency in some ways. It's like biochemical control. So I wonder how that sort of plays into what we as humans should eat more of. Like if a specific tree nut has more tannins than others, is that sort of a signal that maybe we should be eating that more than something else?
I don't think it's a signal that we shouldn't be eating it more, but it might be a signal that if it becomes too hard to remove the tannins and too hard to process, it might be better to eat something else or to feed that. So like for instance, pigs have no problem processing tannins. And if you look back at a lot of sort of English, British Isles history, the acorns there are really high in tannins and the tannins are really hard to get out to leach out with water for whatever reason. And I will say tannins is kind of a murky word. We use it as if it's all the same thing, but it's these different compounds, as you probably know. And there's a lot in the history there where acorns were considered sort of a poverty food and better fit for pigs. Whereas in some other cultures, acorns are really celebrated. And once I started learning more about how hard or easy different acorns can be to process, it started to make sense to me, right? Like if acorns from this area and from this type of tree are really hard and laborious to process because they're so high in tannins and those tannins are so hard to get out, it might be better to feed to pigs and just eat the pig. That might be a better way to get food from that landscape. Whereas if you're in a landscape where you can pour water twice through a batch of acorn flour and all the tannins are gone, that might be a better source of calories. So I think it's not necessarily, I mean, I don't know, maybe it could be considered a signal. And there's also a camp of people who say, some people say tannins are an anti-nutrient, and some people say, well, they're also an antioxidant. And so it's sort of like the poison is in the dose. In that way also. And I think that as a research question, really don't know a lot about tannins. And it sounds like you're in that field. That would be really cool to learn more about, you know, why are some tannins easier to get out or harder to get out? I don't think we really know that. And why are some producing more tannins than others? Probably does have to do with insects, but again, I don't think we really know.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to collect a few different research questions that have come out of this conversation. What comes to mind for you? Like what, as a research community in agroecology, should we be paying attention to?
Well, I think the insect question, the biggest question that I get all the time, and there's just not a lot of research on it, and I'm dying to learn more, is if we're planting, there's a lot of studies on these native species and how they interact with insects in the ecosystem. And there's a lot of studies on sort of non-native species, but when we're looking at a hybrid, which has some genetics of, say, an American chestnut and some genetics of a Chinese chestnut, how much insect use is there of that plant compared to a native species? We don't really know. Like, we sort of know all Chinese versus all American, but if conditions are changing and we need to adapt and change our food crops with that, like, is it a little bit less? Is it like almost none? We don't have a lot of answers to that question. I think that is like a huge emerging question as this movement's kind of taking off in the Midwest. A lot of people are planting chestnuts and a lot of those chestnuts are hybrid, and we just don't really know ecologically how that would work. So that is one of the, I asked so many people about that when I was researching the book, and I got so few answers. And same actually with, there's a lot of talk about biochar, right, as a soil amendment. It's a huge discussion in farming, and there's a lot of talk about the importance of prescribed fire and these fire created soils. But there's not a lot of comparing, like, if we do a prescribed fire and then we know it's going to rain and so it's going to create more charred matter versus just applying biochar. I found one person when I was researching the book who was kind of trying to compare those things, and everyone else I talked to was either like a biochar person or a prescribed fire person, and not a lot of conversation between those. So I think there's still some really big questions about, like, okay, say, the government tomorrow is like, all the money you need to make this huge transition, we're going to just totally switch over. Like, what would happen if you planted a bunch of hybrid chestnuts? What would happen if you tried to manage all these ecosystems with prescribed fire versus spreading biochar? Like, we don't really know. There's a lot of murkiness.
I wonder if another research question has to do with forest management. And we really talk about conservation in all of that, but what you were saying at the beginning about these ideas of wild nature that humans need to be kept away from is very much like the mainstream conservation mindset, right? But yeah, for example, in Vermont, there's Act 59, which is like the Conservation of Biodiversity and Community Stewardship Act. But the community stewardship part of that is kind of absent.
Yeah.
It's more about accumulating land to make sure we hit the target of conservation. But if forest management really requires humans, and we're together in that, and then we want to shift towards things like cultural burning, a different way of managing. I guess there's questions about like how we're approaching who's involved in those conversations, who gets to be part of forest management and how.
Definitely. And actually, someone sent me a link last night to, I guess there's a pretty controversial prescribed fire project through the Forest Service that's getting started outside of Middlebury. I think it was called Moosaloo, I want to say. Moosaloo. Okay, there you go. And basically, the Forest Service saying they wanted to start doing prescribed fire for oak regeneration, and the article was by a community group that is strongly against that. So I think that's happening in some areas around here right now, and definitely an interesting conversation to pay attention to and maybe be part of.
You have a question? No, okay, go ahead.
I was thinking about like, I work for like eco reps on campus, and like we do a lot of the food, like educate people on like emissions of the food they're eating, and we learned that nuts are seen as like carbon negative because like they're part of trees. So is that true? And also, like, how do you think that this nut production and potential consumption plays a factor in like human emissions of like the average diet?
Well, if you're just comparing a grain grown in a tilled annual crop field to a nut grown on a long-lived tree, every time you till that field, you're emitting carbon, and every year that that tree stays on the landscape, it's putting more carbon into the ground. nothing is that black and white or simple, you know, then if you're adding prescribed fire to that landscape, you're burning the top layer, which is creating carbon emissions, but you're also adding a layer of biochar, which is lasts for thousands of years and is sort of taking. I feel like we don't talk a lot about how there's kind of two carbon cycles. You know, there's the immediate short-term carbon cycle, but then there's also the really long-term carbon cycle. And I think that carbon is useful as a measurement, but that when our conversations are only about carbon, a lot gets lost. And so thinking about carbon, but also thinking about it like we have nitrogen cycles, we have other nutrient cycles, we have water cycles, and we also have biodiversity questions, and not letting carbon become the only factor, because then you can just live in sort of a mechanized, carbon removed future that maybe has nothing to do with a healthy ecosystem. So I think it is a really, but I do think, you know, if you're just looking at nut tree versus tilled field, the nut tree is storing a lot more carbon in the ground. At least in the short term carbon cycle. Then it's gonna one day die and re-emit that carbon. So.
Or not.
But
Just incorporates like the trunk. That's
Yeah.
what the agroforestry in tropical countries, they prune lots of service trees they call. And when they're in contact with soil, they just become like soil.
yeah,
So it's not necessarily.
that's a cool way
Reach
to do
the
it.
atmosphere.
Yeah, well, and a lot of the nut trees actually, so a lot of cultures that didn't use prescribed fire traditionally to tend these nut trees have done coppicing and pollarding. So it's a way to keep the tree living a long time, but you're cutting it back. One acorn prescribed fire guy who I talked to, I was like, there's no acorns in this oak woods. What's going on here? And he was like, have you ever seen babies in a nursing home? And his point was that the oak trees there were really old, they hadn't been pruned, you know, they're not producing a lot of reproductive seed in that moment. So yeah, that is, the pruning is another really interesting way to manage.
How are your kids getting involved and following you in this journey?
Well, one is 14, so she is not getting involved. But they both, my younger one especially is a really good cook and likes to experiment with stuff. And they have both, they'll go out and pick up nuts. And I think for me, the most exciting thing to see is like, I grew up with this idea as a kid that there really wasn't much for us to eat in the woods. I didn't know a lot about the plants in my landscape. My parents were bird watchers, so we spent a lot of time like watching the landscape, but not really being part of it and not interacting with it in a way that contributed to our material well-being. And I'll say things to them like, oh, like you can pick these service bear, like, and they're like, yeah, obviously, like that's so boring. So just the amount that can change in one generation about what you know about the landscape around you, like it actually really excites me that they think that that's boring. Because it's just part of how they've grown up and they know that, and why would I even bother to point it out? So that's a very cool aspect, I think, of watching that generational shift.
Maybe they're out doing that right now in the Burlington land.
They're probably at like Sephora.
Well, thank you, Elspeth, so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you for having me. So many good questions.
Thanks online. Thanks again, IFA, L4E. And there's more pizza. We'll stick around in the room. And then for those who are able to get to Shelburne Farms at the Coach Barn tonight, that'll
Yep.
start at 5:30. And
Yeah.
we're really glad you took some time out of the day to be with us today.
Thanks for having me.